So it's my name is Tyler Cann. I'm the director of exhibitions and Pizzuti Family Curator of Contemporary Art here at the Columbus Museum of Art. Although, of course, I'm broadcasting from home. um, I really do look forward to the moment when we can all gather in person. And yeah, hopefully that is sooner rather than later. It certainly feels like we've turned a certain page, but there's a few more chapters left in this pandemic, I fear. Um, so welcome to Dawoud Bey. Um, Thank you so much for joining us. Let me introduce you a bit for those who may not be quite as familiar with the sort of outlines of your biography. Uh, Born in New York, Dawoud Bey is currently professor of art at Columbia College in Chicago. He's been honored with numerous fellowships, including MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship from the NEA. I won't go on. I can't read them all, Dawoud, because it's a very long list
Uh,
um,
uh,
of your many accomplishments.
that's okay, Tyler.
Um, but let me just mention your traveling retrospective, Dawoud Bey, an American project co-organized by the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art and the Whitney Museum of American Art, which is currently now at the High Museum in Atlanta. I believe it closes in mid-March, March 14th. And will open again at the Whitney in April this year. I should also mention that this conversation comes in conjunction with the Columbus Museum of Art's acquisition of a print entitled Number 12, The Marsh, from your recent project, A Night Coming Tenderly Black, which references the presence and passageways of the Underground Railroad in Northern Ohio. In particular, this purchase was with funds provided by our Contemporaries Support Group. So we thank them very much. And it was in memory of Sylvia Goldberg and Donald Dick. And I'd also like to thank Anna Lee for putting forward this acquisition as well. Um, I'm sure we'll discuss it in due course, but the project debuted as a site-specific installation at the Front International Triennial in Cleveland in 2018, and as subsequent presentations at the Art Institute of Chicago. It's a body of work that raises a lot of questions about memory, perception, and place, and how the past resonates within the present. And I've noticed that the word resonance and resonate really recurs throughout many descriptions of your work, Dawoud. But anyway, that's all of that is just to say thank you for being here, and thanks again to all of you for joining us.
And thank you for inviting me and having me. I'm, uh, I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah. And I should also say, please feel free to put a question in the Q&A, or start up a lively conversation in the chat. This is not meant to be an absolutely sort of like formal back and forth between the two of us, and it would be nice to open up that dialogue as well. We'll give some time for questions, hopefully. Um, but I thought we could maybe start at the beginning. Uh, you know, um, I, since you have now put together this retrospective of your work, I mean, that involves a real kind of reorganization of your own past. And so I wondered if you might, talk about the beginning of your practice. And, you picked up the camera quite young. I think you're in your early 20s here. Um,
Yeah, we were talking a moment ago about how interesting the retrospective exhibition is, because the retrospective exhibition, it looks back, even as it brings you forward to a recent moment. But most artists are always most engaged by whatever it is they're working on now. at this particular moment. And the longer one has been working, I've been working for 40 plus years. So when I look back, that's like a 40 plus year looking back to my beginning. Uh, so it's always interesting for me because one of the things that I do think it allows for is for me as the artist to be able to kind of see what some of the through lines of my work have been over the years. This particular project that's on the screen right now, Harlem, USA, began in 1975, and it has to do with at least two things. It has to do with the fact that, in terms of my own personal history, my mother and father met in Harlem,
Hmm.
and
I'm
as a
getting I'm getting some in the chat that there's a bit of a swooshing sound with your audio. I'm sorry to say.
I don't know what to do on my end.
Hmm.
A strong, recent sound.
A swooshing sound. Um,
Let me disappear momentarily and close the.
okay. Sorry, all.
Okay, that might be what it is. Okay, I've closed all the doors, so hopefully that's a little better. Uh, but as I was saying, this book goes back to my own personal analysis. My mother and father met in Harlem. And even though I wasn't born in Harlem, they actually left Harlem shortly after I was born. The place is very much a part of my own narrative. The work also relates to the experience I had when I was 16 years old of going to the Metropolitan Museum of Art when I was 16 years old and going to see the Harlem on My Mind exhibition, which was the first time I'd ever visited a museum exhibition on my own. And there were a number of reasons for going to see that exhibition. But it was a controversial exhibition, and because of that controversy, I went to see the exhibition. It was the first exhibition at a museum I had ever gone to see. First time I'd ever seen pictures of Black people on the wall in a museum, which really made a very strong uh, impression on me. So in 1975, when I began this work, which was really a kind of reintroducing myself to a community that I had a relationship with, but not directly, I wanted to try to figure out how to uh, make work in this community that had such a rich history of visualization and a rich history of cultural production, going back as far as the Harlem Renaissance.
Sure.
So I wanted to participate in this conversation around the visualization of Harlem, both in a personal sense, but in a larger sense as well.
So you really did feel like you were participating, quite consciously in a certain tradition of documentary street photography in Harlem.
Yeah, I was very consciously in conversation with that history. I wanted to contribute something. to that history. To, if I could be that ambitious to say, to add something to the history of the visualization
Yeah.
community.
And
And
did
it
you?
was also very important to me that when this work was completed, I wanted to situate the work in a way that it could be seen in the community in which it had been made. And so for that reason, I approached the Studio Museum in Harlem about having an exhibition of this work in 1978. And that, in fact, did take place in 1979. One of the people who were the subject of the work also have access to the work.
I mean, I'm a child of the '70s myself, and I feel like there are, there's certain elements. I'm from Los Angeles, so if sort of adolescence or childhood is inscribed in the history of photography, is probably John Davola's San Fernando Valley. But um, but there are markers of kind of fashion, and technology and sort of in landscapes that really um, do kind of like feel familiar, that kind of, I think, resonate with one's history. Um, but in putting together a kind of retrospective, I think, um, was that a challenging thing for you? And there are some questions here about whether or not you might have another mic. I'm sorry, y'all.
I don't, and I don't know, it's been fine up till now, so I really don't know what else to do.
Huh? Do you want to maybe exit um, the Zoom and then come back in? Do you think that might be useful? Yes, I'm getting yeah, or you might have some audio options in the Zoom function as well, in terms of which mic you might have. If you go to the
I
sort
don't
of
know
like
what
the,
to do. I don't know what to do on my end. I mean, I have Zoom conversations 2 or 3 times a week.
yeah, and we spoke earlier and it was fine.
Yeah, I've never had a problem. So I don't know that I can change anything on my end.
All right. Well,
I
I
don't
hope,
know. Maybe we can forge ahead. I don't know
yeah.
how does it sound to you, Tyler?
I can hear a bit of a hiss as well, but I can also hear you. There's some forge ahead, says Renee.
Yeah.
So let's forge ahead. Um, yeah, folks can hear you. It's just a bit of a hiss. Not too bad. I'm seeing. Well, thank you all for bearing with us. Um, yeah, so I don't know. Tell me about that sort of like look like sense of feeling like. I mean, this is something where I was kind of going with that thought of sort of recognizing, elements of fashion and kind of like place and time in these photographs. Is, at a certain point you do begin to, think of yourself as historical or your own past as historical. And it, and maybe you can talk about that in relation
I
to
think
sort of like
even
doing a retrospective.
if you look at these 4 photographs, I mean, if you look at the man in the bowler, that could be 1925. That
It
could be
absolutely could.
1932. And then you look at the 2 boys passing the woman, that's a much more contemporary moment. And so that was one of the things that I was really interested in, was to be able to locate uh, in some of the photographs a sense of Harlem's past at that moment. A
Yeah.
past that was kind of quickly disappearing. And this man in the bowler kind of represents that.
Hmm. Yeah, could well be a sort of, James Van Der Zee,
And I've been
image.
looking at Bandage's work before making these photographs. I've been looking at Walker Evans's photographs. I've been looking at a lot of photographs. from the history of photography. And so I was also very much in conversation with those history and their history.
I mean, you came back to doing. Let me skip ahead a little bit because you came back to, yeah, you had some images from the. Here we are. There we are. The kind of redux of the Harlem project in a way. Can you tell me about these as well?
Yeah, these photographs, Harlem Redux, I mean, Harlem, USA was made between 1975 and 1979. And over the decades, Harlem has gone through successive waves of gentrification. Uh, and in 2014, I think, uh, I can't remember exactly. Yeah, 2014. I decided I wanted to make some photographs about what Harlem looked like as it was going through this particular wave of gentrification, in which both the social and the geographic landscape of Harlem was being transformed, both through the forces of gentrification and the influx of global capital into the community, and how the community was being reshaped as a consequence of that. So I wanted to insert myself into that situation as it was taking place, rather than to make photographs of the aftermath of that.
Hmm.
I wanted to make the work about what that transformation was looking like as it was occurring. So from
And the symbol
2000,
of that is the sort of chain link fence, right?
yeah, yeah, because the landscape was being transformed. There was a sense of disruption for people who had lived in the community, a loss of place memories as empty spaces started to show up where something used to be. Uh, and I wanted to make some work about that, just to visualize this moment of transformation in Harlem at this moment, which is a very different moment, of course, from Harlem in the 1970s.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of
And probably the other significant thing, the earlier photographs are made in black and white, and they're very small scale, very classical. Uh, the way, I guess, we would say art photography looked in the 70s.
mm,
It was very much about black and white photographs, and they were rather small. These are 40 by 48 inches. They're much larger, they're color, they're very contemporary, both in terms of the circumstances, but also about in terms of the kind of photographic objects that they are. It's a very different kind of
kind of image
different
making.
material use of
Yeah.
photography. It's just from black and white to color, and the shift in scale from the small to the large.
I mean, that's a shift that came earlier in your work um, as well into color photography. I mean, is this kind of the moment where you introduce color in the early
This
90s?
is
That was the
first here
Polaroid
that I
works?
made. Yeah, these 20 by 24 Polaroids were the first photographs that I made using color material. Uh, and they came after the black and white street portrait work. And I have been working with Polaroid material for a while, meaning being able to work, make the photograph, and see the photograph uh, shortly after it is made. You know, that was the process. This work was directly informed um, by an experience that I had in the sixth grade when I had to write a report on
Mm,
Rembrandt's work. And I kind of fell in love with Rembrandt in the sixth grade. Uh, I was never able to make direct use of that
Mm,
until 1991 when I started working in the Portable studio. My move to the studio had to do with removing a sense of geographical place, removing a sense of sociology, if you will, that comes attached to the subject from being in a particular place, and seeing what would happen if I removed them from that environment and went into the studio and focused my attention more directly on the subject. And it was a very different kind of experience for me because since 1975, I've been working exclusively in the street. Uh, this move to the studio
mm.
uh, was a very different way of thinking about the work. I was working with this large 265 pound Polaroid camera in the studio with backdrops and lights, technician operating the camera. Thereby, the work had up to that point been a very solitary kind of activity for me. And so I began with that influence of Rembrandt, that warm brown space,
Hmm.
singular light source, a kind of heightened sense of the individual in the space. You can,
Yeah, when you mention Rembrandt, it just you sort of like connected to that image, so
oh yeah,
quite
that's
readily.
what and you can see that in this one on the right.
Yeah.
And then the work began to take on a different kind of complexity as I started to begin to make diptychs and tried to push what I could do with this camera in terms of both amplifying the quality of description and also having each piece embedded with a real sense of time. Because the
Hmm.
larger these pieces got, the longer it was taking to make them, some of them 2 hours, 3 hours. So it's playing around with this whole idea of an extended sense of time within the still photograph. And using first my friends as the subject, and then for the larger part of this work, beginning to make young people the center of the work in
Mm,
terms of my subject. So I was working
mm.
about my ideas about making different kinds of photographs, even as I was trying to anchor the work in the experience of these young people, to kind of anchor it in the social world and the world of making an aesthetics at the same time.
Well, that introduction of uh, I think it's kind of interesting that with a Polaroid, which also has this kind of quality of like you think of this sort of like instantaneity, um, where you can sort of see the image, quite quickly, um, and sort of implicates time in that sense. But then you have also kind of spread it out by, having multiple photographs of the same subject.
Yeah. And all of these photographs, after I moved out of the Polaroid studio, all of these photographs with the 20 by 24 Polaroid camera were also made in conjunction with different institutional residencies. So I set up the Polaroid camera in the museum and had young people come to the museum in order to be photographed,
Mm,
in order to make uh, to both make them the subject of the work, but to also give them access to my process uh, as an artist, and to
right.
kind of think about how the museum space could be used in a different way, as a space for making work, not just exhibiting work.
I mean, this sense of sort of engagement with the subject. I mean, I think we could see sort of in some of these earlier photographs, even going back to the first set that we saw, there is a real sense that your subjects know you're there, that you have a real. I mean, it's as much as it's street photography, in that first image, we sort of move into a real depth of portraiture, and um, you know, uh, that you had mentioned Rembrandt, quite famous for the kind of psychological depth of those portraits, is something that you, I think, really bring out in these images as well.
Yeah, and that's something that I've always been interested in the portraits that I've made is even in these momentary encounters in the street. These are made with 4x5 camera and a tripod. So
Hmm.
again, the process is slowed down. But what I'm interested in locating in the work, in these kind of informal, formal portraits, is a sense of interiority, that we're not just looking at the surface of a person, but there's a kind of fullness of the individual that is momentarily revealed on the surface.
This is a 4x5 camera. There was a question about the specific kind of equipment that you used for your street photography. You
Yeah,
mentioned a 4x5.
the Harlem work was made with a 35 millimeter camera,
Mm-hmm.
even though I was using it very deliberately, because I had no sense early on about the relationship of the kind of camera to the kind of picture. I became more aware of that with these photographs. With the made with a large format 4x5 camera, it kind of slows the process down and certainly makes it that much more deliberate,
Mm.
consensual, participatory, uh, because with a large camera on a tripod, the person has to stand here. There's nothing spontaneous about it other than those small nuances, those slight gestural nuances. But
Mm-hmm.
the shape of the photograph is pretty much worked out. So it was a different way of working to extend uh, the sense of time in making the photograph, which became even more extreme with the larger 20 by 24 Polaroid camera.
I mean, since we're on the subject of time, maybe we can also move to the Birmingham project, um, which very specifically sort of engages this notion of time. I mean, specifically, I mean, in reference to the um, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in 1963 in Birmingham, and the kind of aftermath of that as well. But maybe you can speak to this project.
Yeah, the Birmingham project is the first time I begin to uh, make work about a very specific historical moment. As you just said, September 15th, 1963, when the 16th Street Baptist Church was dynamited in Birmingham, Alabama. And I, I, I had what I guess could be called a sort of epiphany moment uh, one morning that led me to feel very strongly that I needed to go to Birmingham. I
Mm,
had never been there before. Uh, I didn't know anyone there. But there was a photograph of the sister of one of the four girls who had been killed in the dynamiting of the church that I
mm,
had seen in a book called The Movement in 1964 when I was 11 years old, pretty much the same age as the girls who were killed in the
mm.
bombing of the church. And I
It's a
saw this
searing
first
image of her with bandaged eyes in
guy,
a bed. It
yeah,
is.
Sarah Jean
Yeah.
Collins, the
Mm-hmm.
sister of Addie Mae Collins, who was killed in the dynamiting of the church. And I saw that picture and it just seared itself into my psyche. And one morning, that image just came rushing back. And that led me to feeling that I needed to go to Birmingham. I needed to make some work there. even though I had no sense of what work I would make. And I just planned a weekend visit just to be in the place and more specifically to visit 16th Street Baptist Church uh, on a Sunday morning so that I could attend a church service there. And once I started spending time in Birmingham, I began to realize uh, in a way that I don't even have time to explain on this
Yeah,
occasion, that history is more complicated, messier, and in some ways even contradictory to what we know. But I left Birmingham after that first trip with a really different sense of the history. And then I started to make return trips. I started doing research uh, at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And in the course of that research, that's when I found out that not only had the four girls been killed in the dynamiting of the church that morning, but two African American boys had been killed in the violent aftermath of that morning.
yeah,
Because white racists were still out in the streets raising mayhem, and two young African American boys, 13 and 16, were killed in that violent aftermath. The
yeah,
girls, one of them was 11, the other three were
yeah,
14. And
yeah.
so
It's
I
worth
knew I
noting
wanted
that
to go.
the two boys, Virgil Ware and Johnny Robinson. Well, Johnny Robinson was killed by a police officer, shot
Exactly. He
in the
was
back.
shot in the back by a police
Yeah,
officer right there in the streets of downtown Birmingham. And Virgil
horrible.
Ware was killed by two white teenagers while he and his brother were riding their bikes.
Yeah,
Uh, and two
com-
white teenagers on a motor scooter came by and shot Virgil Ware and killed him. Uh, Once
just
I knew that
seeing.
the two boys were part of that narrative, I had
Mhm.
to embrace them
Yeah,
in the shape of whatever the work was going to be.
I mean, we know. I mean, those of us who've kind of like come to this as a historical event, know these. Certainly, the four girls, most famously through these photographs, these kind of school portraits of them that are circulated, and you really get a sense of loss, in those images themselves, of kind of lost potential, um, not only for their, in their own lives and the lives of their loved ones, but a kind of lost American
Mhm.
potential more generally. And I think in the same way that you had in those Polaroid images a kind of, an introduction of this sense of time in between two images, um, that really becomes quite beautifully crystallized here in
Yeah,
the two images, and the kind of symmetry of those images that span, um, you know
yeah,
what
the young people in the photographs, for those who might not know the work, they are the ages that the six young African Americans were who were killed that Sunday, and the adults are the ages that they would have been 50 years later. I was making this work 50 years after the dynamiting of the church. And I started by making the photographs of the young people, but the work felt incomplete. And so I decided to also make photographs of African American adults and to put them together in this diptych form uh, so that there is this thing that you just described. And each piece actually embodies conceptually in terms of time 50 years. This is an 11-year-old girl on the left and a 61-year-old black woman on the left and the girl on the right. So each piece embodies uh, 50 years. in a way that felt conceptually more complete to me than the
Hmm.
individual portraits either one of them would have. And again, this work is made working in conjunction with the museum, the Birmingham Museum of Art, and the work opened September 2013, exactly 50 years to the day of the dynamiting of the Baptist, 16th Street Baptist Church. So I'm always interested too, whenever possible, uh, how the siting and the situating of the work can also become a part of the narrative of its presentation.
Mm.
Presenting this work in the Birmingham Museum of Art is a very specific context. Most of the adults in the photograph had never been to the Birmingham Museum of Art. There was a time in the 1960s, like all institutions in the South, at one time the Birmingham Museum of Art was a segregated institution, so they couldn't have visited the museum, let alone thought that 50 years later, a larger than life size image of themselves would
Mm.
be hanging in that very museum, which is also a part of the ambition for the work.
Yeah. And it's really, yeah, establishing a connection between sort of place, community, memory, and sort of like individuals in a really, I think that's part of the sort of like real elegance of your practice as a whole, in that it encompasses, these like relations, within the images, but also sort of expands beyond that to, a practice kind of in the real world, where in seeing these images in a specific place, really heightens their emotional quality, their, a kind of sense of empathy, that I think is really important to, portraiture. But I think it's in its way. I mean, maybe this is
Mm-hmm.
a good segue as well to Night Coming Tenderly, Black. Even though these images are in their way devoid of the kind of like presence of people as subjects, they really, also have very, very specific, um, you know, relationships. Well, maybe you can introduce the project, and then we can maybe get
Well,
in.
the Night Coming Tenderly Black follows the Birmingham project, continues this idea uh, of how to make the past resonate and resonate in the contemporary moment, how to make work that is about the past but is made in the contemporary moment. So I was invited to participate in the front triennial back in 2016. Uh, and I told them that I was interested in participating, but only if I could continue working through this idea.
Mm,
Because once I'm working with an idea, I want to continue to think through that, rather than stop and do something unrelated. So that was my condition for participating in front. But once I started doing research into African American history in Cleveland and northeastern Ohio, I quickly found that the Underground Railroad was a very significant piece of history around African Americans in northeastern Ohio. So I decided to make work about that.
mm,
The challenge being, of course, the Underground Railroad, uh, the actual path of the Underground Railroad of necessity is never known. It was the secret path through which fugitive African Americans escaping from slavery were moving through on their way to freedom. In this case,
In Canada.
yeah, in this case, in Canada, by way of Lake Erie. Uh, and so I started doing research, and of course, there are very few actual Underground Railroad related sites that are documented or known. If you do a certain kind of research, you'll end up at an empty parking lot, or you'll end up at a CVS, or
Yeah.
someplace where something used to be. Uh, and I
Yeah, I think there's some 20 odd sites in Columbus itself that relate to this history, but yes,
Yeah,
not.
and I'm not interested in that kind of work. And
Yeah.
actually, the fact of there being very few actual sites really gave me the space to imagine this landscape, which to me is much more interesting than trying to document actual sites.
Hmm.
So, what few sites I did locate in the course of doing research, I began to explore the landscape around those places, the landscape in proximity to those known sites, trying to uh, imagine this landscape as if through the eye of a fugitive African American moving through this landscape under cover of darkness. The photographs themselves are very dark. They were not made at nighttime. Uh, they were made at various times of the day and then printed to conform to this idea, to realize this idea materially. One of the inspirations for this work comes from Roy Jacob Roberts' photographs, a
Hmm.
lot of which are very dark, and there are these black subjects moving in and coming out of the blackness of the space and the blackness of the photographic object. So when I think about the black subject and the dark, space within the shape of the photograph, I thought about Roger Cavallo. And then I also thought about the last line from Langston Hughes' poem, Dream Variation. I thought about it in conjunction with De Carava. The last
Hmm.
line of that poem is, night coming tenderly, black like me. So I started
Hmm.
thinking about blackness as this tender space through which these black fugitives were moving. And that was the conceptual and the material inspiration for the work. Some of the
Yeah.
locations are actual sites, most of them are not. Some are made
Hmm.
in Cleveland, but in Hudson, Ohio, uh, which is where, among other things, the abolitionist John Brown had his house.
Hmm.
Hudson, Ohio was a very abolitionist community. And I made a lot of photographs in the landscape of Hudson, Ohio.
Hmm.
The photograph of Moss, which your museum has recently acquired, is made somewhere between a quarter and a half mile from where John Brown's house was uh,
Huh.
in Hudson, Ohio. Uh, and, for me, it's all about looking at the landscape through the conceptual frame of as if, because there's no way to know, but I'm looking at this landscape as if the black fugitive subject could have been moving through it, trying to visualize different kinds of landscapes, different physical and geographical conditions of the landscape that had to be negotiated and navigated on the way to Lake Erie. Bodies of water are very important to the work also because one of the conditions of successful fugitivity had to do with fugitive African Americans walking a certain distance in the water. So if dogs were tracking you, when you went into the water, they would lose your scent,
Mm.
and then you would come out at some other point. So I really wanted to make sure that within the narrative of the project, I had different bodies of water because water was a very important part of the narrative and the condition of fugitivity along what came to be known as the Underground Railroad.
There's a question too that sort of matches one that I had about um, the kind of, well, for me, just in looking at some of these photographs, you notice sort of like where the focus is,
Mm-hmm.
and a really, I think, kind of subtle use of the depth of field of the image.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it really, you know, there is a kind of like lusciousness to the kind of like soft focus that is in the background, sometimes of like what is ostensibly like the subject of the image, like a house or the
Yeah.
sort of like trees that are a little bit further into the background. And so and sometimes there is this kind of sense of slight movement, a quality of movement, and I think part of that might be the kind of compositions that don't might focus on something that is maybe a bit more haphazard or all over, like this brambles or trees of twigs. But yeah, tell me a little bit
Yeah, you,
about the process and about
you've
that.
identified something that has long been one of my obsessions, the subjective use of opticality in the making of the photograph. How one reinscribes the sense of spatial experience through the lens. Even you can't see it in the slides, but the large 20 by 24 Polaroid. And even the street portraits, the depth of field is very important for those non-photographers who may be listening. The depth of field basically, they're talking about two-dimensional objects. The photographs are two-dimensional objects. And within the photograph, uh, within two-dimensional objects in general, we talk about the foreground, and then there's this thing called the middle ground, and then there's the background. And the lens determines the relationship between them. Sometimes I need a deep space to carry you across the field and to the house. Sometimes I want to be much more specific and to compress the space and to almost trap you in the space by using a shallower depth of field. But this intentional use of what the lens is capable of has been a central part of my making of photographs. You know, the street portraits, all of those subjects tend to push into your space. You know, there's not a very deep sense of
Hmm.
focus. There's just enough sense of focus to give it a sense of place. But I want the subject to sit in the foreground and kind of push into the space of the viewer. And that's all about how you use the lens. I have a term for it, you know, but it's really about the subjective use of the lens and using the opticality of the lens in a very subjective way that tied to the intention of the narrative for a
Yeah,
particular photograph. So thanks for pointing it out because it's very much a part of something I always think about in making
yeah.
it is the optical quality of it and
And
how
that's
that determines the relationship of things in the photograph and also how it affects the way in which the viewer engages with the work.
yeah. And I think of you know in when I think of images. So I mean, I think what we're seeing here on the screen is actually perhaps even lighter. Is it lightened than what
Yeah,
is
they're for the most part a little darker than
of? Mm,
it's a very, these were by far uh, the most difficult print
mm.
I have ever made.
I can imagine.
Yeah, because it is so subjective. So the very particular material quality. I
Hmm.
wanted them to be dark but rich, dark but legible, dark in a way that approximated the narrative of that particular situation, but also so that one would be pulled into them and feel oneself also see the scale of the photograph.
Yeah,
Because if you get close to them, you're kind of enveloped in those photographs.
absolutely. And if you were to sit down and, one of these pews and have the image, right there before you, it's close enough that it really almost fills your field of view. So it's definitely comes back to this idea of the viewer's body and their kind of like, you know, perception of the image in relation to the scale of that photograph, and it really is transporting. I mean, in the same way that you have this kind of doubled image in the Birmingham project that involves time between two images, it
Mm-hmm.
really felt to me like that relationship of time in Night Coming Tenderly Black is really with you, the viewer, and the image. Um,
Yeah, with this history project, going back to the Birmingham work, this work, the work that I'm doing now in Louisiana, I really want to create this liminal sense that you as the viewer are caught between the past and the present.
mm,
I had a very interesting experience in the work was shown at the Art Institute of Chicago. And I happened by the gallery with a couple of friends, and there were two women who were looking at the work. And when they saw me, they were kind of startled because they were so engrossed in the work and in the narrative. And then one of them said, "Oh, you made this work, right? You made them now, right?" And I could see a kind of disorientation
hmm.
there. Like they were so far into the experience that I wanted to create that they were there. And then when they saw me and recognized me as the person who had made the work, it kind of jolted them back to the present moment in a way that looked they look very unsteady. Uh,
Hmm.
so I think the description
There
is
are markers, I think, in some of the images of time as well. There might be a kind of like electric wires or kind of like satellite dish or something like this. So, it's certain ones, not all of them, but you get clues to a time that you're looking in. But even that, I think, only adds to this sense of like temporal dislocation.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah, it's very much a part because I really want to in making this work to draw you into this narrative, this material, this spatial space of the past, even though it's quite clear that they're made in the contemporary moment. But I want to create this very palpable tension between the past and the present, and
yeah.
both are kind of equally present at the same time.
I mean, the horizon lines in these images too. Especially this one, I think, placed right in the center of the image practically. Um, Also, I think gives you this sense of being between two places.
Mhm.
And, in this image, you don't know from what side of the lake you're looking at. This is the last one in the series, is it?
Yeah, since the last one, and you're looking at what would be 50 miles across uh, to Canada.
Hmm.
This was the last point in Cleveland and northeastern Ohio that fugitive African Americans would stand at before then by boat. making that 50-mile passage across
Hmm.
Lake Erie
Hmm.
to Canada. And I did think of actually going across to Canada to maybe continue this work from there. But I thought better of it, and I thought I would end the work with this particular photograph.
Hmm. Hmm. And the kind of emphasis on the horizon, sort of like metaphorically, it's a place, it invokes a kind of like destination,
Hmm.
um, but also a sense of not being there yet. um, that it's still, it's always 12 miles to the horizon, still, and it makes me think a lot about our relationship uh, you know, to the really difficult and painful histories in this country and where we are and where we have yet to go. Um,
Yeah, it's a kind of it's a very open-ended
hmm,
photograph in its implication, but it's where the narrative ended here for those
yeah.
who were able to successfully um, make that passage. And then,
Hmm,
of course, once uh, fugitive African Americans got to the other side, to Canada, uh, there was a whole other complicated set of circumstances awaiting them on the other side
yeah,
uh,
sure.
as well.
We have another work in the collection, Carrie Mae Weems's "Grabbing, Snatching, Blink, and You Be Gone." It's called, which is work that was taken from Goree Island, sort of quite sort of famously also part of the narrative of that place is the start of the Middle Passage, and it too has this window out into the sea. Um, and another piece, actually, Alison Sarr's a very large monumental sculpture called Nocturne Navigator, which is a very large blue, dark blue figure with sort of
Mhm.
arms outstretched and looking heavenward. And her skirt contains these illuminated constellations of the stars, by which one would navigate. So it's a direct reference to the Underground Railroad and the use of the night sky. So which makes this series very much, I think, embedded in some narratives that exist already in our collection. Um,
Yeah, for me, the interesting challenge is how to use that history or how to use the facts of that history as a kind of way of reimagining that history. A
mm,
kind of radical reimagination based in fact, but it's not meant to be documentation or
yeah,
but the engagement with the work does bring you back to the history. And that's the thing that I'm always interested in is when people go to places like museums where there are objects that are the embodiment of certain ideas or objects that are provoked by certain questions. These are the questions and the provocations that I want them to think about. And I'm aware that I'm in conversation with all of those
yeah.
other objects. Uh, this is my piece of that conversation,
Mm.
you know, both on the
And
object level and also on the narrative level.
photography, I mean, so much has this know, kind of contested, well, this relationship to truth, and you know very typically, most people think of photography as kind of documenting a kind of reality.
Right.
Um, you know, whereas we tend to think of it more as kind of like constructing a certain reality. But I mean, what you say makes me think about, well, makes me think about like that there are some big lies out there. that have a huge impact on the world and how people see it and the narrative that they tell about their own lives. And in defense, to kind of like combat some of that, you need truth, but in a sense you also need a kind of illusion, an illusion that's in the service
Yeah.
of another truth, a larger truth, I
Mhm.
suppose.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you say that because the experience that I was describing with those two women kind of embodies that. I need you to believe the work. If
Hmm.
the work isn't factual, but I need you to believe it. I need to make it compelling enough that you engage with it almost, I would say, involuntarily. That the work engages you. Uh, and because you know what the narrative frame is, you then know what the work is about, even as you are engaged by its particular object quality,
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
know. But the work has to be made at a level that you believe it, that you're pulled into it, that you're compelled to engage with it.
Well, it works. I mean, it's just as a viewer, I could say it's like it's super compelling and powerful in the way that you do feel enveloped by it, that you do feel, you know, I don't know, the word empathy comes back to me a lot in looking at the work. I mean, in this, just perceptually, you're placed in this kind of like dark environment of a kind of like imagination goes so easily to a kind of perceptual sense of what it might have been like, what, and allows us to kind of, it gives us the sort of affordance to imagine oneself in a situation like this that is, I think, critical that that is something that's available, um
Yeah, I agree.
because facts don't seem, I mean, to change opinions, but stories do, images do, and it's that's the real kind of like power of the image, I think, for us, and power of art.
Mhm. Yeah, and I've never wanted to make work that is didactic because I think that work that engages uh, in a certain kind of maybe one way to talk about it is engages in a certain kind of visual poetic
Mm,
have the capacity to I think, work even more deeply on the viewer. As opposed to just blatantly stating the facts. With the Birmingham work, I could have stood outside and made a picture of the church where this happened. And the effect of the
right.
photograph is, look, this happened there. I don't think that stays with you as deeply.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I like to find a way to see the photographs and see the materiality of the photographs and see the conceptual frame, get even more deeply inside of that history and make it resonate through the imagination.
That's wonderful.
I
And
thank
perhaps that's a place to leave it. I see that our time is coming to an end here, but I think we hit all of
if
the.
anybody has any questions, I'm sorry if the sound quality isn't
Yes.
what it
Let me go back to the marsh too, just so that. Um, sorry, we're number 12, are we not? Branches and porch. Huh, where'd it go? Well, anyway, Dawoud, thank you so much.
That's all right.
Um,
Thank you.
for this. I really appreciate this, and I'm really interested in how how we show the work, and the sort of conditions, not just of what's around it, but the kind of like physical environment that the viewer has in encountering this work. Um, so yeah, so this is the work, by the way, for viewers, that the museum has purchased, again with the help of the contemporaries, and we thank them. And once again, we really thank you. So um, I guess we'll leave it there, but hope to talk to you soon. Go
Okay,
ahead.
thank all of you who have stayed with us through,
Yes.
uh, through whatever technical difficulties that Kylie and I are not aware of. We sounded good to go at the tech check, so that's all we have to go by.
Yeah, I know. We really sounded good. We really sounded good.
We were rocking and rolling. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you, Tyler.
Yeah. No, you take care. It was a real pleasure.
Okay, and thanks again. I see some people that I know commenting, so thanks to some of my friends for joining in, and thank everybody else for joining in too. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I guess.
Okay, Tyler, we're going to